answer to some of them.
That's great. That's great. Very good.
Let's go.
Okay, thank you.
Can also anticipate.
I actually want this interview to be more personalized.
Okay.
You will talk as an expert, but also from your personal point of view.
Very good.
You know,
very good.
it's better to have this personable conversation rather than just clear facts.
Okay.
Welcome to the Astana Times YouTube channel. Today we're going to discuss economic reforms and their implications on business environment and foreign investments. To navigate this topic, I invited our esteemed guest, Dean of Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Business, Joep Konings. Thank you very much for coming and joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to start first from your keynote address at the Research Day at Nazarbayev University, where you talked about key drivers of economic growth and lessons for Kazakhstan. Could you elaborate on that and share it with us?
The first thing to know is what's really driving economic growth. All governments around the globe, they're all concerned about maximizing economic growth. In Kazakhstan, in 2023, economic growth was more than 5%. The expectation is that in 2024, economic growth will again be very high, close to 5%, which is amazing because most countries in the world have growth rates which are much smaller. But what I did in my analysis, in my research, and on that research day at Nazarbayev University, I also identified other factors of economic growth, not just key enabling technologies. There's three other key enablers. One is key enabling institutions, and that's very important for Kazakhstan. Another one is key enabling firms. And another one, the final one, is key enabling management practices. And all three of those, they matter a lot for the Kazakh economy and actually to also shape economic policy and shape economic reforms. For instance, key enabling institutions, then we're talking about, creating institutions that foster what we call creative destruction. And creative destruction refers to the fact that you need to have a dynamic business environment. You need to have a situation where firms can easily enter in an economy and push out those dinosaur firms which have become inefficient. And for Kazakhstan, this is very relevant because we still have a lot of these dinosaur firms. Going back to the early 90s and the Soviet time. So key enabling institutions, which is, typically refers to competition policy, other forms of regulations, free markets and so forth, they are very important in this context. The second one is key enabling firms. What recent research shows is that about 80% of all value added in an economy and also about 80% of all jobs in the economy is accounted for by only 15 to 20% of all firms. So it's a small group of firms that really take care of most of the value added created in the country. And so this means that it's a small group of typically large firms that matter a lot. Of course, that seems a little bit contradictory because on the one hand we say creative destruction, new firm entry is important. And on the other hand, we see, well, it's these large firms that matter a lot. But that doesn't mean that these two cannot go hand in hand, because what we need the entry of new firms that will become the superstars of tomorrow. And the third important aspect that I discussed in my talk in that research day was the importance of management practices. Now, there has been a survey going on across the world. It's called the Global Management Survey, where manufacturing firms and other types of firms have been investigated on their management practices, and they were rated between a score of 1 to 5. And so what you see is those firms that typically score high, they typically grow faster, they have higher productivity. If you then aggregate this up at a country level, you see those countries who typically have on average better management practices, they typically also have higher economic growth. They have better export performance. So when you compare then the scores that typical Kazakh firms have compared to the rest of the world, Kazakhstan can do much, much better. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit which would allow us to improve the economic performance of this country. Mm-hmm. And so these were the three additional key drivers of economic growth that I highlighted on top of innovation. And so when you think about economic growth, economic policy and economic reforms, it's good to bear these kind of drivers in mind.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us, do the recent economic reforms address these challenges and these points of growth that you've mentioned?
There are so many challenges, and I'll pick a few. So for instance, when we say it's important to create an environment of creative destruction, so these institutions, that means we need to avoid the dominance of monopolies. Well, it is true that the government pays especially attention to trying to break monopolies and monopoly power. It's hard, it's difficult, because you cannot say, oh, we have here a couple of monopolized firms which are often still under state control, and let's just privatize them, and it's solved. No, because then you privatize a monopoly, and so then the problem is not solved. Just privatizing the monopoly is not a solution. So first, you need to break up already a few firms, make them ready to operate in a competitive environment, allow other firms entering the market, and then you can start thinking about privatizing firms and breaking up monopolies and fostering a competitive environment. Of course, we have the Competition Policy Agency here in Kazakhstan, which is actually stepping it up, its efforts, and so I believe they are in the right direction. There is attention of the government to, paying attention to create a competitive environment, and so that's the good way forward, but there's still a long way to go. I think the government is on its right direction in doing that. They realize that this is a problem that needs to be taken care of, and it's also in the context of developing SME growth and creating an environment where new firm entry is made much easier. And I believe there's also a number of steps taken there which go into the right direction. For instance, on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, there are favorable tax conditions to start a small and medium-sized enterprise. There are programs which train small and medium-sized enterprises. I believe there could be more done to help the human capital, the knowledge of entrepreneurs. There have been quite some initiatives to train also and support female entrepreneurs in Kazakhstan, also in rural areas, and that's very important. We know that female entrepreneurship is often a key driver of businesses, especially in rural areas, and so it also empowers women, and that's important to use that power and to use that force, and so there have been quite some initiatives supporting that, so that's very positive. Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about SMEs, I wanted to ask you about the foreign direct investments. How can they help transform the economy and help grow SMEs, because it's one of the key drivers for economic prosperity of any country?
Oh, absolutely. Foreign direct investment is so important, and there are various dimensions to it. Last year was one of the most successful years to attract foreign direct investment in Kazakhstan. There was an increase of more than 80% in foreign direct investment, and a lot of them were greenfield investments, so first-time investors. And they are not restricted to just the traditional sectors that we think of, oil and gas, yeah, we know. No, it's very important that we also attract here in Kazakhstan investments in other sectors. And so, for instance, Kia Motors, they have invested a substantial amount here in Kazakhstan to set up an assembly plant with more than 1,500 potential jobs. We've seen investments of Italian companies in machine textiles, and especially for insulation material to produce that, which feeds in the construction sector. And so we have a lot of examples. Dutch firms investing in agriculture, in the food processing industry. So that's very important. It is important because we often say that, and this links to what I said earlier about these superstar firms, key enabling firms. Foreign firms are often what we call these superstar firms. They dominate not only the business in one particular country, they dominate the business globally often. When these firms come to Kazakhstan, they're not here in Kazakhstan alone, they're also in other parts of the world. And they typically have the more superior technology. They typically have the better know-how. They typically have the better management practices as well, based on this global survey of management practices. And so that all generates spillovers to the local economy. These spillovers, they take place because a small firm now can start supplying such a superstar firm, right?
Mm-hmm. General economic reforms that have been very actively implemented in Kazakhstan. In your opinion, your personal, how would you evaluate the effectiveness of the economic reforms?
Well, it's always very difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of economic reforms because it depends on how much money is being put in the system. And so then you really want to know the $1 we put into the system in the form of a subsidy or a tax break, did it generate more than $1, right? Now, if you look at the performance in terms of GDP growth of last year, it's fabulous, 5%. Is this because of the reforms? Maybe, maybe not. Don't forget that there has been a lot of relocation of Russian and Belarusian enterprises to Kazakhstan, and it stimulated quite a bit growth. That entry
of new business.
New businesses and relocation of businesses. When we look at the numbers, we know that there has been quite a lot of investment, especially also in the transportation sector and the storage sector, so logistics in other words. So Kazakhstan was able to take over a little bit the role of the logistic hub to supply the rest of Central Asia, which perhaps before was in Russia, and with the Russian war, things have moved here. So that's an example where I think Kazakhstan was successful in attracting and taking advantage of the situation. But I think to pick one example which is often under discussion, what the central bank has been doing in Kazakhstan, I think that's really an example of a great success.
Oh, can you explain that to me? Because I have so many questions about Kazakhstan having such a high interest rate.
A few years ago, we had an inflation rate in Kazakhstan close to 20%.
Yes.
Now, inflation is 8.5%. The inflation target is 5%, right? So it's amazing that inflation has gone down so fast. Why is that? That's because the base rate is kept relatively high, but it came down. Before it was close to 18%, it came down to now 14.75%. Typically when you look at these kind of policy measures, monetary policy measures, it's very important to put it in perspective with the rest of the world. What you want to compare to is with the European Central Bank, so how the European Central Bank is setting its base rate and how the United States is setting their base rate. Because when we think about the exchange rate, the tenge, we most of the time think exchange rate relative to the dollar, right? And so we've seen inflation in all parts of the world.
Yes.
The base rates went up in the United States and in Europe. And so in all parts of the world, this went up. So if in Kazakhstan the base rate would go down too fast, well, then most likely the exchange rate would start collapsing. The exchange rate has been extremely stable in 2023 and in 2024 as well. That's amazing. It's a big achievement because if you go back to the discussion we had about foreign direct investment, if I want to invest in Kazakhstan, I will do business in tenge, right? Except in the oil industry, but in all the other sectors, and we want to diversify. right? So I do business in tenge. I sell cars to Kazakhs, so I get money in tenge, right? So my tenge needs to be stable. And so the fact that we kept the tenge stable is thanks to keeping the base rate at 14.75.
Again, with the foreign direct investment, how do you think these reforms affected the desire of Kazakhstan to diversify its economy? Because of course it's an oil-based economy most of the time, but with the Europe kind of renouncing oil and gas in the future, Kazakhstan has to jump on the wagon and choose something different.
Kazakhstan has to diversify. We always refer to the Dutch disease. So if you have oil income, it's easy. Why should we diversify and things like that? The government is very much aware of that, and they're also doing it. And so the question is, okay, what should the government try to stimulate? If you think about economic policy, industrial policy, well, typically, maybe 10, 15 years ago, economists would say, oh, industrial policy is something dirty. The government should not really involve free market spirit, right? Nowadays, every economist believes that some kind of industrial policy is justified. But there are a number of conditions that need to be fulfilled. One is that you cannot distort competition in the market. Another one is also, and we have done research on this, is if you engage in industrial policy, try to do it in these areas where you as a government have more knowledge. And the third one is, well, do it in areas where you as a country have a comparative advantage, where you have a relative advantage compared to the rest of the world. Now, energy, Kazakhstan has a comparative advantage. They have a lot of knowledge and know-how. What's the long-run trend in energy? What's the future? It's all about sustainability. It's all about renewable energy. Now, there's been a lot of initiatives attracting foreign direct investment in the area of renewable energy. That includes traditional companies like Total, but also new German companies that are experts in wind energy. Not so far from Astana, we have a huge wind energy park. It's an obvious direction the government is taking and actually stimulating this as well. Look at the country. Kazakhstan is the largest country of Central Asia. There's so much space. You can put up so much wind energy. You can put up so much solar energy. It's all renewables. And it's free. The investment is not free, and it's a big investment. And the government stimulates this by giving subsidies and trying to attract also foreign firms to invest, to buy their know-how. But it's infinite flow of energy that you can get. And so eventually you earn it back fairly fast.
And you can export it.
And you can export it. There are challenges. You need to have the right grid, the electricity grid and so forth. Storage is a challenge. But technology is moving so fast that also the storage problem is being solved. Not so long ago, I was in China, in Beijing. And the last time I was in Beijing was perhaps 15 years ago. And when I was in Beijing 15 years ago, I could hardly breathe. There was so much pollution. Now I went back to Beijing. The air smelled nice, sunshine. I thought, where's the pollution? Then I took a taxi, an electrical car. Then I looked around. 90% of the cars in the streets in Beijing were electrical or hybrid. Well, they made the transition. And so it improved the quality of life because pollution went down. And we know some of the research that we did at the business school in Nazarbayev University as well shows there's a clear correlation between crime and pollution.
That's interesting.
That's a research that was done based in Almaty, where there's a lot of pollution, and so that was linked to crime rates. And so there's a clear relationship, and that's actually not the only study on this. There's also some work on that for the United States. But that's just an example where the government has a choice. Either we say, oil, they always said that oil is a limited source of income. But they said it 10 years ago, 20 years, 30 years ago.
And they're still buying it.
And so why change? Well, nowadays things are starting to change. There's a younger generation that go for the green economy, that are concerned about climate change. That's one thing. But geopolitically as well, Europe is moving very fast towards renewable energy. And so it's just, China is doing this as well. And so it's just a global trend. And I expect in 10 years from now, this will be very dominant. Countries who use fossil fuels to produce stuff and want to export it to Europe, sooner or later may have to pay a tariff on that because it's not produced in an energy-friendly way or a fossil-free way. And so these are examples where, in the long run, you need to take these aspects into account.
And my last question would be, since you, deal with our students maybe from other countries and of course from Kazakhstan, human capital, people are the new oil, there's a saying.
Yeah.
How would you evaluate our human capital in Kazakhstan?
Our students at Nazarbayev University and at the Graduate School of Business are excellent. I'm always amazed by how good they are. It's actually really a unique project that we embark upon. Education is so important. Our students, they are as good as the students in the top schools in Europe and the United States. The problem is, it takes time. And so we need a lot of work to educate our people. And so I think we still have a long way to go. Investing in education, investing in research, because what makes us different from many other places in Kazakhstan is that we are a research-intensive university, a research-intensive business school, which feeds its way into our classroom. This means that what we teach our students is going to be relevant in 5 years from now. Mm-hmm. I hope the government realizes that and really puts resources aside for research projects and research at universities, and so far we are on the right track, and so I'm very, very positive about how Kazakhstan is evolving, but we still have a long way to go.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.